Welcome everyone to the Burning Archive live stream on Are We Sleepwalking to World War Again? How are today's events in the world, the war in Ukraine, the economic crisis, the political uncertainties, the wars and conflicts in various parts of the world, the enormous tensions between China and America over who's top dog in the world. That is the world crisis. And the question is, how similar is it to July 1914, the immediate prelude to World War One and all the catastrophes that happened in World War One? And in this live stream, I'm going to sort of bring together three things that I do on the Burning Archive channel. I'm going to talk about history. I'm going to talk, sort of introduce you to some really good recent books in history. I sort of do book reviews, but it's more I sort of help highlight a few quality books, quality history books that can help inform you about current issues, current debates in the world. And I'm also going to talk about geopolitics or the big issues in current world affairs and try to draw those together in an interesting, kind of objective sort of way. Maybe not objective, but an interesting sort of way, let's say. I can only be as objective as I can. And my name's Jeff Rich. I do the Burning Archive YouTube channel, which you're watching right now. And I also do a podcast, the Burning Archive podcast, which comes out every week on a Friday, and that you can get on, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, the main sort of podcast platforms. And I also have a weekly free newsletter at jeffrich.substack.com, which you can type that into your browser now, sign up for free, and you'll get 7 glimpses of the multipolar world every Saturday morning from me, what I'm reading, what some of the big issues are, and some unusual and interesting reflections on culture, history of the whole multipolar world. So, the topic of today's live stream, which is my third live stream, so I'm starting to get the hang of it, and feel free to drop me a line in the chat there if you wish, or also you can, if you're watching it on the live replay later on, then please just leave me a comment and I'll respond. And I know there were a couple of comments to my live stream last week, which talked about the elections in Thailand and Turkey, as well as the sort of political crisis in Pakistan and in America, democracy's discontents, which I might get to later in the show. But today the question is, are we reliving World War One, and how can we learn from history about it? And there are 5 books that I really want to talk about in order to explore this comparison between 1914 and 2023. Explore this comparison between the conflict in Ukraine and the perhaps especially the economic conflict across between China, America, Russia, and I guess let's say the global South, and what happened in World War One, and I should also mention that I'm streaming today from Melbourne, Australia. What is it? Today is the 23rd. Yes, it's the 23rd of May, 2023. It's 12:30 p.m. roughly on that day in Eastern Australia, and the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, is currently in Australia, and there's a very large Indian population in Australia welcoming him. He's doing some major events. It's really quite a significant diplomatic, geopolitical, cultural event with Narendra Modi's visit, and I may well talk about that on the stream next week. But this today's stream is about these 5 books, which I'm just showing you up there on the screen. It's Christopher Clark's Sleepwalkers, The Sleepwalkers, Robert Gerwaf's The Vanquished, Why the First World War Failed to End, Dominic Leven's Towards the Flame, and Adam Tooze's Deluge, and they're all current, contemporary, currently working or recently retired historians. And then the final book, 5th book, is a bit of a classic, you could say. One which I'm not necessarily putting forward in the same way as a recommendation so much, as one that's perhaps important to absorb the story from, and that is Winston Churchill. Yes, Winston Churchill, former Prime Minister of England, particularly Britain during World War II, and his book about the First World War and the world crisis that it emerged from, and that is the world crisis. Part of a long series of books he wrote about World War One after World War One. So that's the topics for today. Do feel free to send in your comments or chat if you're with me live. But I'm doing these live streams partly just to give myself a bit of a break from video editing over the next couple of weeks and months, because I'm also sort of proofing and editing my next book, which is called 13 Ways of Looking at a Bureaucrat. So doing the live streams is a little bit easier, it lightens the load a little bit in terms of video editing time for me. So I'd love to respond to your comments in that you might send commenting on the live replay, and I'll also send some shorts, highlights. I'll post some short highlights of this stream onto my YouTube channel. Now, what I should also say is that the literature on World War One, the historical literature, I mean, there's the fictional and poetic and journalistic literature on World War One, which is absolutely enormous. But the historic literature on World War One is also enormous. It's one of the most written about events, very complex event in historical literature. And it's also one which you'll find an awful lot of videos on YouTube and I guess things like the History Channel, that sort of thing on as well. And I'm not doing this video with the pretense that I'm fully across that literature. It's actually, in a way, too big for anyone to really be fully across, especially if you want to do it from the perspective of the whole multipolar world. You've got to look at it from Russia's point of view and Germany's point of view and Britain's point of view, France and Africa and India and China, Japan, America as well. So it's absolutely enormous literature. And there is so much about it, so much written about it, and so much material about it. In fact, in one of the books that I'm going to talk about in Christopher Clark's The Sleepwalkers, he concludes his book, by writing that, referring to the novelist Rebecca West, looking back in 1938 to the conflict and saying, we will never know why it happened, not because there are too few facts, but because there are too many. And that's part of the issue with World War One. You can, in terms of making use of so much, there is so much material out there. But it's easy to, I guess, get in a certain groove of telling the story about World War One without realising it's a very partial story. And that's partly because it's just it's almost humanly impossible to actually orient yourself to so much written and visual material. It's, of course, there's cinema and there's photographs and all the rest of it. There's all the museums. And I mean, I can just show you, I've just, out of my own little personal library and a quick trip to the public library. Oh, it's like doing weight training, just gathered. I mean, there's about a dozen books right there, some of which are absolutely fabulous books, like Margaret Macmillan's The War That Ended the Peace, or a book on the Indian Empire at war, telling the story of World War One from the Indian perspective. And classics like John Keegan's The First World War or Hugh Strawn's The First World War. So enormous amount of literature, and I'm not pretending to be absolute scholar of all this sort of stuff. I'm just someone who, maybe like you, is reasonably well educated, reasonably well informed, and is looking at how the world is, shaking out today and going, what the hell is going on, and how on earth can I make sense of it, and how can I draw on some of the best historical writing today to not necessarily find the answers, but at least explore some of one's own judgments and intuitions a little bit better. And of course, anything as complicated as a world crisis, either in 1914 or in 2023, can be told from many, many, many different perspectives. I, live in an English language speaking country, which is, in its media and its education institutions, its political culture, dominated by, I guess, the Anglo-American heritage. And you get a very particular take on World War One, indeed World War Two, and the Cold War from that sort of Anglo-American historical heritage. And what's more, so it's good to look out for some different perspectives, but without wanting to get absolutely, caught in the headlights of there being so many choices to choose from. Where on earth in all that enormous literature do you begin? And that's, I hope, what this kind of video or this live stream can help you with. What's more, we're also sort of bombarded with simple or simplistic narratives of both World War One, World War Two, and the world crisis today. It's very much, it's what people are responding to, in the sense that there's a bit of a propaganda message going on in the media about this conflict, and the art of propaganda has always been a feature of world wars, but it was certainly a key feature of World War One as well. But it's often in those sort of simplistic stories about what's going on today and what happened in 1914, or how today is similar to, Munich 1938, and we need to stop appeasing the dictators. There are a whole lot of assumed similarities, and I think it's good to look at some different perspectives and some different books about World War One to enrich our comparisons of things, and to think a little bit differently about today's world crisis, with the benefit of a more rounded, or at least some different multipolar glimpses into the history of the World War One, the Great War, as it was called back then. And people are, interestingly enough, making comparisons between events today and events back in 1914. For example, when Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, and Xi Jinping, the leader of China, met in Moscow for a summit I think it was in March. Xi Jinping said to Vladimir Putin as he was leaving, the world today is going through changes it hasn't seen for 100 years, and we are guiding these changes together. So what happened 100 years ago? Well, what happened 100 years ago was World War One and its consequences, the human catastrophe of World War One, the collapse of empires and the remaking of empires, the fundamental shifts in the economies of the world, in the culture and in the political systems and the diplomatic systems of the world, the international relations systems of the world. But it's not just Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, who some of you might regard as, unreliable witnesses, even though they think they're leading these biggest changes in 100 years. There are others who say the same thing. For example, the journalist Martin Woolf, who's a very establishment journalist at the Financial Times, a sort of, you could almost call him like a court historian of globalization. He wrote in 2019, so several years ago, and I guess, between 2014, like 2014 to 2019 was the centenary of World War One through to the Treaty of Versailles, and as a result, there was a huge amount of historical writing and commemorative activities and journalistic articles and documentaries and TV shows, etc., which kind of explored, new thinking or commemorated the suffering and the events of World War One. And so it was very much of a piece, and quite a few of the articles, of the books rather, that I'm going to talk about today were actually produced in that period as part of that effort. There was clearly a huge market for, there's always, I think, a big market for books about World War One and World War Two. Certainly on the History Channel there appears to be, and on many of the other history channels on YouTube. but there was a huge market for these for books about World War One, and many people were reflecting at that time, back in 2019, about how the world has changed, or how there are some similarities between today and 2014. And back then, Martin Wolf said that today's era is a mixture of all three of these. It is marked by a conflict of political systems and ideology between two superpowers, as in the Cold War, by a post-financial crisis, decline of confidence in democratic politics and market economics, as well as by the rise of populism, nationalism and authoritarianism, as in the 1930s, and most significantly by a dramatic shift in relative economic power with the rise of China, as with the US before 1914. For the first time, where are we? For the first time, I've lost my place. Just give me a second there. For the first time since then, the US faces a power with an economic potential exceeding its own. So you get some of the themes there that people are talking about. But more than that, also within the broader culture, it was a sense that there was a dramatic change in sensibility and culture in the world in that early second decade of the 20th century. So many of the great works of literary modernism and musical modernism were in those first two decades. The shock and horror of the war had a profound impact on people's cultural sensibilities. But in some ways, those cultural sensibilities were also changing before World War One. Virginia Woolf, the great British writer, novelist and essayist, diarist, Virginia Woolf wrote that on, or in her sort of kind of fey, charming sort of way, on or about December 1910, human nature changed. All human relations shifted. And when human relations change, there is at the same time a change in religion, conduct, politics and literature. And this sense that human relations perhaps are also changing, maybe, I don't know, December 2016 perhaps, or December 2010, let's say, or December 2014, to choose an arbitrary date in the recent times, perhaps March 2020. That sense that there's been a fundamental shift in the people's personal lives, their actual cultural lives, and then that is also flowing through into these sort of big macro issues of politics and war and economics that people talk about all the time in geopolitics. And that's my sense too, and why I say on the Burning Archive podcast that we are going through a crisis or a change that we haven't really seen for 100 years, and it has both a international relations dimension, a geopolitical dimension, a social dimension, by which I would include, economics and all that sort of stuff. It also has a political dimension, democracy, how well is it performing, or that sort of thing. The rise of new non-Western democracies, non-Western models of democracies, and also a profound sense of cultural change. So there are these common elements to that period back in the 1910s to our era today, perhaps from the 2010s and certainly in the 2020s. So that's the kind of world crisis. Now let me, another aspect of that is we get this recurring metaphor that we're sleepwalking to war, which is a famous phrase describing events. Just for example, there is this essay that came out in Australia not so long ago by Hugh White called Sleepwalk to War, Australia's Unthinking Alliance with America. And that same metaphor is the one used in the first book that we're going to discuss, Christopher Clark's Sleepwalkers. Now,